On December 23, 2017, the temperature in the Sovsky district on the outskirts of Novosibirsk had dropped well below -20 degrees Celsius, the kind of bone-deep Siberian cold that keeps most people indoors and empties the streets of casual foot traffic. It was just after 2 in the afternoon when a handful of motorists traveling along Sofyskaya Street toward a nearby residential neighborhood noticed something out of place at the edge of a roadside tree line, half concealed in the shadows of the birch and pine. Partially visible in a shallow depression, just a few meters from the pavement lay a large, dark-colored travel bag, the kind designed for heavy cargo or long journeys. Investigators later noted in case materials that the object had been only lightly dusted with snow on its surface, suggesting it had been placed there recently, likely within the previous 24 hours. When the responding police unit arrived on scene, officers assessed the size and unusual weight of the bag and made the decision to open it on site. What they found inside would launch one of the most disturbing criminal investigations the Novosibirsk region had seen in years. Inside the bag was the body of a young woman. She was dressed in a black hooded-down jacket and short suede boots, her frame folded tightly to fit the dimensions of the bag. Forensic examiners at the scene noted a deeply troubling detail. The victim's head had been wrapped in multiple layers of clear polyethylene plastic film, sealed tightly around her face in a manner that would have completely blocked her ability to breathe. No identification documents, no phone, and no personal belongings were found anywhere on her person or in the bag. The victim's identity could not be established at the scene. A careful search of the surrounding area in a radius of several meters from the depression revealed no visible signs of a physical confrontation or any disturbance in the snow, a detail that led investigators to quickly form the working theory that the young woman had lost her life elsewhere and that her body had been transported to this location afterward and deliberately placed to delay discovery. The investigation that followed would eventually trace back 2 full days to December 21, 2017, the last morning Kristina Prikhodko walked out of her home alive. Kristina was 19 years old, a third-year law student at the Siberian University of Consumer Cooperation, and by every account that emerged during the investigation, she was a focused, disciplined, and deeply principled young woman. She had grown up in the home of her father, Konstantin Prikhodko, a retired military officer whose values of structure, responsibility, and integrity had shaped his daughter from an early age. Kristina had been raised largely without her mother, who had struggled with alcohol dependency and had not been a consistent presence in her daughter's life following her parents' separation. Rather than allowing that absence to define her, Kristina channeled it into an almost fierce sense of self-reliance. She worked regularly alongside her studies, with entries in her employment record showing stints as a waitress, a cleaning professional, and a promotional worker at a local retail store. She did not view physical or service industry work as beneath her. She viewed it as honest, and she viewed the income as hers. Her academic goals were equally serious. Faculty members and classmates described her as hardworking and attentive, someone who came to lectures prepared and stayed after class to ask the right questions. Her ambition, which she had shared openly with friends and instructors alike, was to complete her undergraduate legal degree and then apply to a military institute, with the ultimate goal of becoming a military lawyer and following, deliberately and proudly, in the professional footsteps of her father. Konstantin later told investigators that he and Kristina communicated constantly, and that they had an agreement, built more on mutual trust than on imposed rules, that she would always let him know where she was going and when she expected to return. To make that easier, both of their smartphones carried a real-time location monitoring application that allowed him to track her position whenever he wanted to check in. On the morning of December 21, everything followed the established routine. Kristina left the family apartment on Pervaya Grushevskane Street at approximately 9 in the morning. The tracking app confirmed her presence at the university campus throughout the morning hours. Her phone transmitted steadily and reliably from the academic building throughout her classes. It was in the early afternoon, as lectures wrapped up and she prepared to leave, that the day began to change. Starting around 4 in the afternoon, Kristina's phone went unanswered when her father called. Konstantin noted that the calls were connecting, meaning the phone was on and functioning, but she was not picking up. The location data on the monitoring application showed her phone beginning to move away from the central part of the city, tracking in the direction of the Sovsky district. He continued calling. The phone remained on but unresponsive. The tracking point slowed and eventually came to rest in an area characterized by private residential housing and scattered dacha-style properties, and then, for a period of time, it simply held that position. At 8 in the evening, the signal disappeared entirely. The device had either been deliberately switched off or had lost power. Konstantin immediately began contacting everyone he could think of, working through a list of Kristina's friends and acquaintances, none of whom knew where she was or who she might be with. By late that evening, it was clear to him that this was not a situation that would resolve itself by morning. He drove to the Pervomayski District Police Station and filed a formal missing persons report. He did not yet know, as he sat across from the duty officer and described his daughter, that the frozen location point on the tracking map, the one that had held still for hours before the signal cut out, corresponded almost exactly to where investigators would later determine the crime had taken place. What Konstantin also did not yet know was that Kristina's boyfriend, Alexander, had already noticed something alarming in her social media activity. While Kristina was still reachable by phone, and before her disappearance became apparent, Alexander had looked through her messages on the VKontakte platform and discovered an exchange she had been having with a profile listed under the name Sergei Osipov. The account raised immediate red flags. There were no real photographs, no personal information, no verifiable identity markers of any kind. It had the hallmarks of a fabricated profile created specifically to conduct a transaction and then disappear. The content of the conversation, however, was straightforward enough on the surface. Osipov claimed to have found Kristina through a job search group popular among Novosibirsk students and had offered her a paid cleaning engagement at a private cottage. The property was described as a single-story residential structure of roughly 120 square meters, and the task was a one-time deep clean. The offered payment was 3,000 rubles, to be handed over in cash immediately upon completion of the work. During the exchange, the account had asked Kristina her age, verified her availability, and provided logistical details for the meeting. She would be picked up by the account holder's wife at the parking area of the Leroy Merlin store, adjacent to the mega shopping center, and driven to the property in the Sovsky district from there. Alexander had told Kristina directly that he was uncomfortable with the arrangement. He pointed out that the profile had no legitimate identity behind it, that the offer felt constructed rather than genuine, and that meeting a stranger at a parking lot for an unverified cash job carried risk. Kristina had listened to his concerns and calmly countered each one. The pickup location was a public, well-trafficked area, she said. She would be accompanied by a woman. She had done cleaning jobs before and was comfortable with the work. She told him she would be fine. Alexander, respecting her judgment and her autonomy, did not press further. That evening, after her phone had gone silent and Konstantin had already filed the missing persons report, Alexander sent a message to the Sergei Osipov account asking whether Kristina had shown up for the job. The reply came back quickly. The account claimed she had never arrived at the meeting point. Investigators studying the case from the inside out reconstructed December 21 in careful detail. After her last university lecture concluded around 2 in the afternoon, Kristina made her way toward the agreed meeting point. Surveillance footage from cameras positioned at the mega shopping center parking area captured what happened next. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, a vehicle pulled up near the Leroy Merlin entrance. Inside the car were two men, Sergei Yulin and Maxim Ovchinnikov. There was no woman in the vehicle. Despite the explicit assurance in the online messages that a wife would be meeting her, Kristina approached the car. Based on available evidence and the subsequent reconstruction of events by investigators, she was taken from that location and transported to a property in the Sovsky district, specifically within a dacha community designated as SNT Svetofor, where the primary criminal actions took place over the course of the following hours. What happened inside that property was subject to extensive forensic and biological analysis in the months that followed. Evidence collected at the scene confirmed the commission of serious crimes against Kristina, including a violent attack of a sexual nature, before her life was ultimately taken from her. The plastic film used to cover her face had been brought to the location in advance, as had the large travel bag that was later used to transport her body. Investigators also found evidence of heat-generating equipment at the site, items that were part of a prepared arrangement rather than a spontaneous situation. The premeditation involved in the staging of this crime, from the constructed online profile to the pre-positioned materials, would become a critical element of the prosecution's case in the months ahead. By the time police units arrived at the location on Sofiaskaya Street on December 23 and opened the bag, they were working backward from a discovery and forward from a disappearance report simultaneously. The connection between the unidentified victim and the missing 19-year-old was established through a combination of physical description, clothing details, and the information gathered from Konstantin's missing persons filing. The formal identification of the body as Kristina Prikhodko was a moment that devastated everyone who had hoped the 2 days of silence might have an innocent explanation. It also immediately transformed the investigation from a missing persons inquiry into a homicide case. detectives from the Novosibirsk Regional Investigative Committee took over the lead. Konstantin, consumed by grief that he later described in court proceedings as all-encompassing and inescapable, became a central figure in the investigation, providing critical information and refusing to let the case drift toward inaction. The digital trail left by the fake V-contact profile of Sergei Osipov became one of the earliest and most productive avenues of inquiry. Law enforcement analysts traced the account's activity, its creation, its messaging patterns, and the IP addresses associated with its use. When investigators later examined the electronic devices seized from the suspects, they found that the Sergei Osipov account was not operating in isolation. There were additional profiles, similarly constructed with false names including Sergei Ismailov and Sergei Sergeyevich, each of them used to approach young women through the same job listing community groups. Some of the targets of these approaches were minors. The offers in each case followed the same blueprint: a cleaning job at a private property, a cash payment, and a pickup in a public location intended to establish a sense of safety. The pattern revealed a systematic method, not an impulsive act. These men had done this before, or at least had tried to, and the infrastructure they had built to find and approach victims was deliberate and calculating. The question investigators and journalists would later explore was why Kristina, a third-year law student from a military family who was fully aware of the risks of unverified online contacts, had proceeded with the arrangement despite the warning signs. The answer that emerged from the investigation was shaped by context that was both entirely ordinary and entirely heartbreaking. In December 2017, Kristina had two pressing financial motivations. The first was personal. She wanted to buy Christmas and New Year gifts for her father and friends using her own money, without asking anyone for help. The second, confirmed by a close friend of hers during police interviews, was academic. She had accumulated some outstanding coursework obligations at the university that carried a financial cost to resolve before the winter examination period. 3,000 rubles for a few hours of cleaning seemed like a proportionate and accessible solution to both problems at once. The evening before she disappeared, Kristina had spoken with her father about her plans. Konstantin, whose instincts as a retired military officer were sharpened by decades of assessing risk, had immediately opposed the idea. He told her he would give her 5,000 rubles outright, more than the job paid, simply to keep her from going. Kristina declined. She told him she was an adult who could take care of herself, and that she preferred to earn what she needed rather than accept it as a gift. This was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was an expression of exactly the values he had raised her with. She had simply applied that independence in a direction that no amount of good character could have fully protected against a predatory scheme engineered to exploit trust. Following Kristina's identification, investigators pursued Yulin and Ovchinnikov with speed and precision. The combination of cell tower data, surveillance footage, the digital record of the V-contact accounts, and forensic evidence collected from the SNT Svetoffer property built a case that was comprehensive and damning. The suspects were identified, located, and taken into custody. When police examined the areas connected to the men's movements on the night of December 21, they found evidence consistent with the destruction of personal documents. In a remote zone near a series of garage structures, the charred remains of what were later identified as Kristina's passport and her university gradebook were recovered. The men had attempted to burn the documents thoroughly, but forensic analysts were able to confirm their partial identities through surviving material. This act of deliberate evidence destruction, combined with the calculated staging of the crime scene at the dacha property and the organized disposal of the body on Sofiaskaya Street, reinforced the prosecution's argument that every step of what happened on December 21 and in the hours that followed had been thought through in advance. The timeline reconstructed by investigators showed that at approximately 7:30 in the evening, after the primary crimes had been committed at the dacha, Yulin and Ovchinnikov moved to the logistical phase of their plan. The travel bag, which had been prepared ahead of time, was used to remove Kristina's body from the property in a manner designed to avoid drawing the attention of any neighbors or passers-by in the dacha community. At 8 in the evening, which was the same moment that Kristina's phone signal went permanently dark, the vehicle left the SNT Svetoffer grounds. The route took them through the Sovsky district to the section of Sofiaskaya Street they had chosen for the disposal. They stopped at the pre-selected location, moved the bag into the natural depression in the snow, and manually covered it with loose snow to blend the dark fabric against the surrounding landscape. Then they drove away, destroyed the documents, and returned to their homes, where they resumed the appearance of ordinary domestic life, calculating that without a direct link between the fabricated Sergei Osipov identity and the missing student, investigators would not reach them. The character assassination attempts that surfaced in the early days of the case whispers suggesting that Kristina may have been involved in something questionable or that her behavior had contributed to her fate, were addressed head-on by the investigative team and dismantled completely. A full social and biographical review, including interviews with her professors, classmates, and friends, combined with a review of her financial history and personal communications, produced a portrait of a young woman with no criminal associations, no involvement in any questionable activity, and no motivation beyond earning honest money for a legitimate purpose. Her father provided corroborating documentation of her work history. Investigators formally concluded and stated publicly that Kristina Prikhodko had fallen victim to a sophisticated fraudulent scheme that was designed specifically to exploit the vulnerability of young women seeking legitimate employment, and that no aspect of her behavior had been reckless or responsible in any meaningful way for what was done to her. That official finding became an important record during the trial, where the defense had sought to use the absence of official prior complaints and the informal nature of the job arrangement as tools to complicate the narrative around the defendant's culpability. In September 2018, the Novosibirsk Regional Court began hearing the case on its merits. The trial was closed to the press and to public observers, a decision made because the proceedings involved detailed testimony about the sexual nature of the crimes committed against Kristina. Konstantin Prikhodko attended every session. He later described in interviews the experience of sitting through those hearings, the clinical language of forensic testimony, the photographs, the reconstruction of timelines, all of it filtered through the lens of knowing that the young woman being described was his daughter. He also described what he observed in the behavior of Yulin and Ovchinnikov in the courtroom. Neither man made any attempt at any point during the proceedings to offer condolences, to acknowledge the suffering of Kristina's family, or to engage with the relatives of the victim in any human way. Kristina's grandmother, Lyudmila Vladimirovna, who attended hearings alongside Konstantin, reportedly demanded on more than one occasion that the defendants look directly at her, but the men responded by turning their faces away, pulling hoods over their heads, or using sheets of paper to block their faces from view. Witnesses described moments during the proceedings when Yulin and Ovchinnikov were observed smiling and exchanging glances through the glass partitions separating the detention area from the courtroom, in full view of the grieving family. The defense strategy built around a partial admission of conduct while disputing intent. Ovchinnikov positioned himself as having played a secondary role, claiming he had not been the primary actor. Both defendants rejected any argument that what happened had been planned from the outset as something that would result in a fatality. One of the more startling claims advanced on their behalf was that the use of plastic film around the victim's face had originally been intended as a prank or a scare tactic, one that went wrong through carelessness rather than intent. Prosecutors methodically demolished this argument by presenting the physical evidence of preparation: the bag, the film, the heat equipment, all of it assembled and brought to the location in advance, all of it consistent with a plan rather than an impulse. The prosecution asked the court to impose 24 years of imprisonment for Yulin and nearly 25 years for Ovchinnikov. On September 14, 2018, the Novosibirsk Regional Court delivered its verdict. Sergei Yulin and Maxim Ovchinnikov were found guilty of violent crimes of a sexual nature and of carrying out a killing in concert as a group acting under prior agreement. Yulin, identified by the court as the primary organizer of the scheme, was sentenced to 22 years in a strict regime penal colony and ordered to pay a fine of 120,000 rubles. Ovchinnikov received 18 years in a strict regime facility, along with a fine of 50,000 rubles. The court also granted Konstantin Prikhodko's civil claim for emotional damages in full, awarding a total of 6 million rubles, 4 million from Yulin and 2 million from Ovchinnikov. Speaking to journalists outside the courthouse after sentencing, Konstantin said he was satisfied with the verdict and had no intention of filing an appeal. He relayed that legal professionals involved in the case had privately told the family that given the severity of the conviction category and the absence of any eligibility for amnesty, early release was effectively off the table. Under the terms of the sentence as imposed, Ovchinnikov was expected to remain incarcerated until 2036 and Yulin until 2040. In the years that followed, Konstantin received regular small wire transfers into his bank account, amounts ranging from roughly 1,000 rubles to slightly more, representing deductions from the convict's earnings within the penal system. For a father who had no other way to verify that the men who killed his daughter were still behind bars, those modest monthly payments became the only tangible confirmation that the system was holding. Then, in August 2024, something changed. Payment arrived in Konstantin's account from Ovchinnikov, but it was not the usual small deduction. The transfer was 75,000 rubles. Konstantin contacted the relevant authorities seeking an explanation. He was told that information about the current status of both convicted men had been classified and was no longer available to him. Refusing to accept that answer, he traveled in person to Correctional Colony Number 18. What he learned there confirmed what the unusual payment had already suggested. In February 2024, Maxim Ovchinnikov had signed a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense, agreed to participate in active military operations, and upon completing a period of service had received a formal pardon, allowing him to walk free years before his scheduled release date. The situation with Yulin was identical in outcome, if not in exact timing. Despite earlier assurances from colony administration that Yulin would not be eligible for transfer to a conflict zone given the gravity of his conviction, he too had been released from incarceration. According to information later obtained by Kristina's father and subsequently reported in independent journalistic investigations, Yulin was officially freed on December 21, 2024, the exact date that marked 7 years since the day Kristina was last seen alive, 7 years since she left for what she believed was an honest afternoon of work. Investigative reporting, published in the months that followed, indicated that Ovchinnikov had already transitioned back into civilian life, having reportedly purchased property in the city of Orenburg using financial compensation he received through state military programs. In current media coverage of the case, the faces and full names of both men are now concealed behind digital pixelation and reduced to initials, in line with updated editorial policies that took effect following their release. The legal judgment handed down in that Novosibirsk courtroom in 2018, the one Konstantin had been told represented a firm and lasting consequence, had effectively been rendered void. The men who took Kristina's life from her had been handed back their own, and her father was left holding the question of what justice actually means when the sentence no longer holds. He still cries every